Welcome to the second video in this tutorial where we build a simple 2D platformer in Unity. In this tutorial, we are going to be making the player move and flip and jump inside of the level that we created in the last video. Alright, so to start off our player, we're just going to create an empty game object in our hierarchy, and we can name this player. We can make the transform, and we can move this into the main camera, so it's right here on top of this little box. And then we can add a sprite renderer component to it. And then for the sprite render, it's going to ask for a sprite. So we can go into Pixel Adventure 1, Assets, Main Character, and then you can choose any character that you like, but I'm going to choose Mask Dude. So right now, I'm just going to go into the Run. If I click that little arrow, it gives me all these different sprites. If I go into the player, I'll just drag this first one in, and you can see that it's really small. So we can just make him just a bit bigger. So scale would be maybe 6. And then there we have our player. So we're going to have to create a player movement script so this player can move around. So inside of our assets, let's create a new folder. We'll name this scripts for all of our scripts. And then inside of this scripts folder, let's create a new C# script. We'll name this player movement. And this will have all of the code for the player movement in it, so the player can move and jump around on all of the platforms that we made. So we can double click and open up this script. In our coding editor, I have this Microsoft Visual Studio, but you can choose whatever coding editor that you would like. Once it loads up, we can start the code and we can create our code for the player to move around. Alright, so when the code editor loads, you will come across to a screen like this. You'll have two methods, start and update, but we don't need start right now, so we can just delete that. And for the beginning, we are going to get a reference to the rigid body 2D of the player that we'll add once we get back into the Unity editor. So we'll get a rigid body 2D. We can name this rigid body 2D. And then we'll make this public instead of private. And then, so we can set it in the Unity editor. We can have a public float. We'll name this speed. We can set this to something like 8. And then what we'll do inside of update, we'll create a float, and we can name this X movement, and we'll set this equal to input.getAxisRaw, and that's going to look for a string reference, and we can put horizontal, and this is basically just a number that is specifying if we're moving right or left with the right or left arrow keys or the A or D keys on our keyboard. So what we can do is we can do our rigid body 2D dot velocity, and then we will set this equal to a new vector 2, and then the first parameter of the vector 2, we will set this to X movement times our speed, and then the second parameter we'll set to our rigid body 2D dot velocity dot y. So we won't change our velocity on the y axis. So that should get us running around, but we would also like to jump. So what we can do is, inside of update, we will check if input.getKeyDown, and then keycode.space. So this is checking if we are pushing the space button. So if we do this, and so if we do that by two of the and symbols, and then and is grounded is equal to true. This is a variable that we are going to set. And is grounded is equal to true. We're going to jump. So up at the top, let's create a private boolean and name this is grounded. We will make this is grounded true or false on every frame. But what we'll want to do right now is inside of this if statement, if the input is dakiko.space is and is grounded is equal to true, or we could just do is grounded. We don't have to do is equal to true. So if that is happening, we can add force to we can jump. So what we'll do is we'll do rigid body 2D. We'll take the reference to our rigid body 2D, and then we'll do dot velocity, so we can get the velocity of our rigid body, and then we will change it to a new vector 2, and the first parameter being the rigid body dot velocity dot x, because we don't want to change our velocity on the x-axis. And then the second parameter will be our jumping. So we will jump. We'll add force to jump. So we can just do okay, and now we need to create a method that checks if is grounded is equal to true. So let's create a new private bool, and we'll name this method is grounded. This will check if the player is on the ground or not, and it needs to return a boolean. So we can do return, and this is going to be a physics 2D, and it's going to return a physics 2D dot overlap circle. And that is just checking if a circle is overlapping with a certain layer. So, and that circle will be on the player's feet, and we'll check if it's colliding with the ground. So we can do physics 2D dot overlap circle, and it will have 3 parameters. We'll need to make a few more variables for this. The first one will be a public transform, and this will be the ground check. This will be the circle that we put in the player's feet to check if the player is touching the ground. So it'll be a public transform, and we can name this ground check circle. We're also going to need a public layer mask, and that's just a layer like the ground or the player, and we'll name this ground layer. So the first parameter in this overlap circle is going to be the ground check circle. It's just the transform of the circle. The second is going to be the radius, so we can make this something like 0.25. And then the third is the layer mask, so we can do ground layer. And then this will complete, and it will check if all of these parameters are true. The boolean will return true, and if it doesn't, then the boolean will return false. This needs to be the ground layer, and then it's ground check circle dot position, so it checks the whole position and not just the transform of it. So after we have that, we can check, instead of in this if statement, if we push the space key and is grounded, we can change this is grounded to the method is grounded, and then we can call this method so that if this method returns true, this will go true. And then if we go back into Unity and it imports and we put this script onto the player, then the player should be able to move and jump around. But we have to do a few things in the Unity editor first, like adding all of the public variables that we had. We have to put them into the editor, and we have to add the layers onto the player and the ground so that the player knows what the ground is. And we also have to add the ground check circle so that the ground check circle would know when the player is on the ground so he can jump again. And then when the Unity editor compiles, you'll come to a screen like this, and we can go into our player game object, and then what we'll do is we'll go and add a few things to it. We are going to add a box collider to this so that it can collide with things, and we can take it and we can shrink it down a bit. So if we click this edit collider button, we zoom in, we can hit these little boxes and add them right to the player where it is so that the player will collide like that. We can also add a rigid body 2D so that the player will move. And then you see we have it right here. Then we can also add this script to it. We can add the player movement script to it. And then you see it has a few variables right here. A rigid body 2D, we can drag in our rigid body 2D. The speed and jump height we can keep the same. The ground check we can add. We won't actually use the ground check, but we'll use the ground check circle. And then the ground layer we can add from this drop down right here. We'll add it to the ground. So if we go into the player, we right click, create empty, we can name this ground check circle, and then it will just be a regular circle, and we'll put this at the player's feet. So if we click W, we can see where this is, and we'll put it right at the player's feet so that he will always be able to see if the player's on the ground or not. So we can go down to here, and then we'll drag this ground check circle into the ground check circle, and then we can go into the grid, and we can go to the terrain tile map, and you see all of this terrain will line up. And then we can go to the layer, click add a layer, and then we'll add a layer, and we'll call this ground. So if we go into the terrain tile map, we can add the ground to that layer, and then the ground check circle, or in the player, in this drop down right here, for the ground layer, we can click the drop down and click ground. So if we save up this, one thing that we'll want to do before we enter play mode is we can go into our terrain tile map, and then on this rigid body 2D, we can change this body type from dynamic to kinematic, and that means dynamic means that it will move, and kinematic means that it won't move. So we can just keep it as kinematic so that the ground won't move as the player runs around on it. So if we click play once more, the player should be able to run around and jump on this level. And then we come to this screen. This is where the player is, and we can see if we click the left and right arrow keys and the jump, he moves around. The jump does seem to be a lot, and there is a few other errors that he is not moving, the player does not flip when we move him left and right. We can change that, but what we can also do is we can go into the player while we're still in play mode, and then down all the way at the bottom in the player movement script, we can go to the jump height, set that to something like 5, and set the speed to something like 5 too. If we go back into here, we can see that this seems to be a lot nicer, and that the player can jump onto all of these things. So if we exit play mode, those values will go back to their original values, 10 and 8, and we can change them both back to 5. That seemed nice for me, but you can change it to be whatever you'd like. And now we can make the player flip. So let's create a new private void method, and we can name this flip. And this is just going to be changing the one thing in the player, and it's the local scale. And that's if the player is flipped or not. So we can go back into here, and then we will check a few things. So we can check if our rigid body 2D, and if the velocity dot x, so if we're moving on the x-axis, is greater than 0. If this is greater than 0, then that means we're moving to the right. That means we don't have to do anything. So we can just not put anything in here. And then we can do another if statement, and then if the rigid body 2D dot velocity dot x is less than 0, and then we will need to change the player if it's less than 0. So what we'll do is we'll do the game object. To get the game object that this script is attached to, we can do transform.localScale, and we'll set this equal to a new vector 3. And then in this vector 3, we'll set the x value to -1, and then we'll set the other values to our transform.localScale.y and transform.localScale.z, because we don't really need to change these, so they can just stay the same. And then the transform.localScale.z. So we're basically just changing the value on the x local scale. So what we can do in this if statement that we have empty right now, we can just take this and we can copy and paste it into the other if statement, because it's going to be the same exact thing, except that this -1 should be changed to a +1. So if you are going to the right, you should look to the right, and if you're going to the left, you can look to the left. And then finally, we should go to the top of update, and we can call this method inside of update. We can call the flip method inside of update. So if we go back into our Unity editor, once it compiles, we will be able to have our player flip on the x-axis when he moves to the left and to the right. Before we go into play mode, though, we'll want to go into our player, and then go into our rigid body 2D, and then in constraints, we can freeze rotation on the z-axis. So that means the player doesn't turn around, because we really won't want him to in this tutorial. So we'll click play, wait for the Unity editor to compile, and then we will see if our game works. When we enter play mode here, we see that we have a little problem, that our player gets squished. And that is the problem because when we go into our player and then we check the local scale in the transform, you see that our scale is not 1, it's actually 6. So we'll have to go back into our script here and change this from -1 and 1 to -6 and 6. So this means the player won't stretch at all when we move him and we play him in the game. Now we can click the play button and see if now that our game will work once we have fixed that one tiny error. Now when we enter play mode, we can see that our player looks like this, and we can move to the left and to the right. Our player switches back in between, and that it works just fine. See, our player now flips like he would do if he was a normal person. Thank you for following along through this tutorial. If you like this tutorial, please subscribe to our channel and like the videos. I hope you had a great time, and please come to the next tutorial where we make the player have animations and so that the camera can follow him across the screen in the level that we created in the last tutorial.